With me now is Nick Yarris, a former death row prisoner himself, who was then acquitted of rape and murder. Nick, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get into your extraordinary case in a moment, but first your reaction on we'll get to the means in a moment as well, but on another capital punishment execution in the US yesterday. I mean, did you think it's awful that this practice still takes place?
I went through a similar experience where I was sentenced to the electric chair. I remember the judge telling me I was going to be taken to the Rockview State Prison where 2,200 volts of electricity would course through my body and end my life. And then they changed it and made it lethal injection. So I wasn't ever sentenced to be stabbed with a needle, but they changed it. And that's what they're doing here. So what's bothering me, is troubling me, is they tried to execute this man for hours with needles. Imagine laying on a gurney and they're poking you in your groin, in your neck, all over your body, trying to get a vein to murder you, and you succeed in surviving that, only to be an experiment like a guinea pig. So this is horrifying that the state of Oklahoma and the state of Mississippi are going to start doing this, because successfully, opponents of the death penalty stopped them from getting the drugs. And it was, like I said, an ordeal to try and get the drugs into people.
And so your take on this new method, nitrogen being used, is clearly a negative one. You think he was used as a guinea pig?
The man held his breath for as long as he possibly could. This wasn't someone being euthanized who was suffering. This was someone clinging to the last moment of life. That's horrible.
Well, it certainly is. And you have personal experience of having the prospect of being executed ahead of you. I mean, I don't even know where to start. What is that experience like?
It's the greatest experience of my life. I'm so grateful that I went to death row, because all my childhood friends died of drug overdoses or violence or suicide, and I was spared the AIDS epidemic, and I started to learn self-respect and self-love. And I elevated my entire life because I was on death row. And even though I was there wrongly, it didn't matter. I needed to use that opportunity, and I have since.
Well, I mean, that is an unbelievably positive perspective, and it's amazing to hear you have such a perspective. I guess it does rest on the fact that ultimately you were cleared. I mean, if that had not happened...
I had to ask to be executed to get that done. I was physically tortured for years for being a rapist murderer they thought was mentally ill. I went through a lot of degradations, but I learned when people are harming you, you can really find it within yourself at that moment to love you. A lot of people in life don't love themselves. Thank God I was openly tortured so that I could learn that. I just released my new book called Mind Your Heart, Nick Yarris, 20 Years of Freedom. I was released in January 2004. I moved to the United Kingdom in January 2005, and I fell in love with the idea that not everyone's out to murder you.
I mean, again, I'm stunned by your perspective. It's quite unbelievable that you're able to have such a positive perspective on this, and I'm glad the last 20 years of your life have been so much more positive. If I may, just to go back to this extraordinary experience, you said there you asked for the date to come forward.
Yes, sir. I was sick in prison. I do apologize.
No, please.
I was suffering from hepatitis C infection after they beat me and broke my teeth in prison, and I contracted this illness that was killing my fellow prisoners. So after listening to them die in horrifying fashion with the nurses taunting them, I asked that my appeals be dismissed and my lawyers be dismissed so that I could be executed.
So at that moment, presumably, you didn't have the same positive perspective you have now, and you really thought genuinely the end is just around the corner.
When you listen to men being tortured before they die, you don't want to be tortured. You don't mind dying, but you don't want to be tortured. And they were doing this horrible thing. I was convicted of raping a woman that I never met in my life. And they openly tortured me for that. And I didn't want to go out like that. So I tried to come up with a beautiful way to die, speaking beautifully on my own behalf enveloping all of the process as best that I could without the indignity of being ignorant. That was my whole fear. I spent 23 years in solitary confinement. That means every day of my life I was locked up 23 hours a day while I was being openly tortured.
Talk to me about when the good news arrived. 2002, you sought your own execution because of this terrible experience that you've been telling us about, released 2 years later. In that 2-year gap, the new DNA evidence arrived. It must have been the most fantastic moment.
Unfortunately, no. The day that I was proven innocent, my brother was having a seizure at my mother's feet because he was an alcoholic who had a brain injury, and she couldn't celebrate. And then they took me off of death row and they put me in a mental cell because they feared I was going to kill them for what they did to me. So I spent the last 8 months of my life in prison in a mental ward being told that no human being could endure what we did to you without you being angry enough to kill one of us. So we're not going to trust you until we open the door.
I just am completely stunned. What an unbelievable ordeal and what extraordinary mixed emotions. The fact that you're able to end all of it with a positive emotion is truly, truly commendable. I just wondered, Nick, your perspective more broadly on the practice of capital punishment still existing.
We cannot regulate human behavior. This is why drug laws do not work. Someone today, this is sad, in the state of Alabama, someone's going to be murdered today. Statistically, they have a murder a day there, you know, so that death penalty last night didn't do anything to stop it.
So you want the death penalty to remain or to be...
No, it doesn't work. No, it has no bearing on human behavior. Today, someone went out and killed someone in Alabama, and they didn't care that the state executed someone. So what's the point?
And do you think that that will ever happen in the US? It's something, as you know from spending 20 years here, it's one of those things that exists in the US that Britons are somewhat shocked remains today. Why does it remain in the US with enough support?
It's only in a few certain former slave states, Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and these are prevalent statistics. In the South of America, in which they used to have open slavery, they have little regard for human life. Mm-hmm. They are pro-birth, not pro-life. They don't mind putting you in prison for an abortion, but then they'll take your life if you commit a crime. It's idiocy.
Well, Nick, your story is quite unbelievable and extraordinary, and as I've said a number of times, your perspective on all of this to be so positive is quite inspiring. I didn't know you had a book. I'm going to go out and buy it. What was it called again? It's
called Mind Your Heart, Nick Yarris, My 20 Years of Freedom from Death Row. I just want to use my opportunity to stop young people in this country from killing themselves. We have the highest rate of suicide across the United Kingdom. So my goal going forward is showing a lot of young people in the UK especially, you don't have to kill yourself as an answer. And if I can get that message out there, then everything I went through on death row has meaning.
Nick Yarris, thank you so much for joining us.